When it comes to medieval history, most people tend to focus on Western Europe, places like England, France, and Germany. Even those who go further east tend to stop around Poland or Hungary. But there's one medieval kingdom that often goes under people's radars: Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus has often been assumed to be completely separate from medieval Europe, partially due to early modern ideas of Russia as a very backwards place, and further reinforced by the Iron Curtain mentality of the 20th century. But within the past few decades, medievalists have been making an effort to reevaluate this view and have been coming to realize that Kievan Rus was very much a typical European state in the Middle Ages. It was indeed very much connected to the Byzantine Empire, but the Byzantine Empire was also not nearly as separated from the rest of Europe as has often been assumed. But at least with Byzantium, most people know a thing or two about it, whereas most of my medievalist colleagues hardly know anything about Kievan Rus. Which is why in this video, the second in my series on the world 1,000 years ago, we're going to look at Kievan Rus in the 1020s. Before we get started, I need to mention a few points on terminology, starting with the term Kievan Rus itself. Rus was a term which the Rus themselves used, but Kievan Rus is modern. It's used to describe a medieval state which is the ancestor to all three modern Eastern Slavic countries: Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The name is essentially a compromise, though some people will still call it medieval Russia, usually in literature specifically tracing the history of Russia itself. Things get a little bit more complicated when it comes to cities. The most important city in the Kievan Rus is almost always called Kiev in English, based on the Russian name for the city. However, in terms of spelling and pronunciation, I've chosen to use the Ukrainian-based names for cities presently in Ukraine, namely Kiev instead of Kiev and Chernihiv instead of Chernigov, for reasons which I hope are fairly obvious. Most of these cities had names which were different in Old East Slavonic anyway, the language spoken at the time, so the one that we choose to use in modern discourse is mostly really a matter of custom. Finally, there's the matter of the title used by the leaders of the Rus, knyaz. This term is traditionally translated as prince, or less often as duke, with Veliki knyaz being translated as grand prince or archduke. By the way, please forgive my pronunciation, as I don't actually speak any Slavic languages, so I'm doing my best with what I can. This translation can sometimes be misleading and limiting, as the terms prince and duke often hold different associations in people's minds than a term like king. Christian Raffensperger has made a rather good argument in his book, The Kingdom of Rus, that the Rus knyazia were no different from kings in the rest of Europe. He noted, for example, that Latin sources refer to them as reges, which means kings, and that the word knyaz basically just means leader, having the same etymological root as the English word king. If you want more information on this argument, I do recommend reading his book. However, for this video, I'm still going to use the term prince, both because it is by far the most common translation, and because, despite how many people understand it today, it really just means ruler, as in the case of the early Roman emperors as well as the Prince of Wales. That being said, I would like you to keep in mind throughout this video that when I'm talking about princes, these princes, the knyazia, were indeed kings. So, in order to understand what happened in the 1020s, we have to go over some background. The princes of Kievan Rus ruled over the Eastern Slavic peoples who had been living around the major rivers of Eastern Europe since at least the 1st century, with this region thought to be the homeland of all Slavs. By the 9th century, these rivers had become central to a network of trade between the Black and the Baltic Seas, which, being the height of the Viking Age, led to Scandinavian raiders and adventurers looting the region and eventually settling down and ruling over local Slavic tribes. This was most famously the case for a man named Rurik, who became the ruler of Novgorod around 862. At the time, the Slavs referred to Vikings as Rus, and as these rulers adopted Slavic culture and customs over time, the term came to be used for the people over whom they ruled as well. Just over 100 years later, one of Rurik's descendants, known to historians as Vladimir the Great, managed to become the sole ruler over all of the Eastern Slavs, thus making them all Rus. His reign was important for a couple of reasons. First of all, he converted to Christianity in 988, which had a huge impact on the future of the Rus. But he also changed the social fabric of his people in other ways as well. When he came to power, the Eastern Slavs were very much still divided into various tribes, paying tribute to the most powerful amongst them who happened to be ruling from Kiev. By the time of Vladimir's death in 1015, however, the Rus were becoming one people, organized around towns and local princes, and Kievan Rus itself became a single kingdom. Likewise, from this point on, power in the kingdom was held exclusively by Vladimir's dynasty, and rulership became inherently tied to it. There was no such thing as a prince who was not a descendant of Vladimir, a state which remained until the Romanovs came to power in Moscow in 1613. But Vladimir had many children, partially due to the fact that he had many concubines before converting to Christianity. While he was alive, this let him consolidate his dynasty's power, as he placed his sons as local princes in various towns, especially in the more peripheral parts of his realm, in order to collect tribute and defend trade and the frontiers. When he died, however, this caused some issues. A lot of ink has been spilled over what Vladimir's plans were for succession, and unfortunately I don't really have time to go over all of it, but whatever it may have been, it clearly didn't hold, and in all likelihood there wasn't a whole lot that was established concretely. In the end, his eldest living son, Svyatopolk, Prince of Turov, made his way to Kiev and declared himself prince. However, whether out of fear, jealousy, or maybe even just detached pragmatism, he sent out men to kill his younger brother Boris, who was supposedly Vladimir's favorite, and who'd been out with an army to fight the Pechenegs. Svyatopolk also had his other brothers, Gleb and Svyatoslav, killed, and this prompted yet another brother, Yaroslav, who was Prince of Novgorod, to retaliate. At least this is how the Russian Primary Chronicle presents the events. But it should be kept in mind that this text was written in the 1070s under the reign of Yaroslav's descendants, and after Boris and Gleb had been considered martyr saints for decades. So it's not unlikely that there's some bias in the narrative. In any case, Yaroslav assembled an army of Novgorodians and Varangian mercenaries, Varangian being another common term for Scandinavians at the time, and he kicked Svyatopolk out of Kiev. Svyatopolk was the son-in-law of King Bolesław I of Poland, however, and he returned with a Polish army at his back in 1018 to retake Kiev. But after Bolesław's men left, Yaroslav came back to defeat Svyatopolk once more, who then fell sick and died as he tried to flee back to Poland, leaving Yaroslav as the Grand Prince of Kiev in 1019. By 1020, therefore, Yaroslav, known later as Yaroslav the Wise, held the same position as his father had. There were also 3 other princes, that we know of anyway, who continued to hold territory in the realm. Yaroslav's youngest brother Sudislav ruled Pskov on the western frontier. Another brother, Mstislav, ruled Tmutarakan far away on the Sea of Azov in the east. And finally, there was Yaroslav's nephew, Bryachislav, who ruled over Polotsk in modern Belarus. These other princes owed fealty to Yaroslav, but they were fairly autonomous, extracting taxes and ruling with the help of their own families and their druzhina, or their retinue of companions. As for the rest of the realm, Yaroslav, who had no adult children of his own yet, relied on his own druzhina to administer it. The druzhina was made up of warrior aristocrats who were closely tied to the prince, much like the retinues of other medieval rulers. Also, like these other rulers, these retainers were the core of his support. They were his closest courtiers, often serving as his stewards and legates for the government of the realm, though we shouldn't necessarily see it as a complex bureaucracy. The druzhina did have stratification and a hierarchy, with powerful senior boyars, or landed nobles, being the most likely to serve in these positions, but it was informal, and the positions were like ad hoc gifts more than offices with established roles and relations to anyone other than the prince. The prince also needed to ensure the Druzina's loyalty through said gifts, as well as through shows of strength. Otherwise, they might not support him in his time of need. The prime example of this is with Boris, whose Druzina, many of which were said to be Kievites, wanted him to retake Kiev from his brother. When he refused out of fraternal love, they abandoned him, leaving him vulnerable to the assassins Svyatopolk sent to kill him. That's the story, anyway, but even if it's not 100% true, the existence of this story tells us that such a thing was at least conceivable to the Rus in the 11th century. The prince's power was also concentrated around the town, or towns, over which he ruled. He was, without a doubt, the most powerful individual in the urban hierarchy, but as towns became more central to Rus society, they managed to obtain a power of their own. Each town had a veche, or town council, which could assemble to decide on matters independently of the prince. The composition of the veche is not really known, with some suggesting it was an assembly of all free male citizens, like the democracy of ancient Athens, and others assuming it to be composed of the most powerful elites, especially traders and artisans, which to me seems more likely. The veche's power could vary, but it was often powerful enough that princes felt the need to obtain its approval in certain circumstances. For example, when Svyatopolk took Kiev, the chronicle states that he didn't have the people's hearts, and so he needed to bribe them in order for them to accept him. The town's support for the prince was conditional, and he needed to negotiate for it, especially for support in wartime. Amongst other things, the towns were important centers of trade, and this was especially true of Kiev and Novgorod. The trade between the Baltic and the Black Seas remained important at this time, and trade with the east opened further by trading down the Volga River and into the Caspian Sea. The Rus traded things like furs, wax, honey, and slaves in exchange for luxuries from Byzantium and the east like glasswork, silk, wine, and precious metals. Novgorod was especially important for the trade network as a primary hub for luxuries to enter into the Baltic, and for goods like walrus ivory and fur from the northeast to make its way south. This might also be why Bryachislav of Polotsk sacked Novgorod in 1020 or 21 while his uncle was away, though Yaroslav managed to intercept his nephew on the way back and defeated him. There's very little information about this event, and it doesn't seem to have created any specific animosity between the two, though it does show how Polotsk was becoming increasingly separate from Kiev, something which would happen in many other parts of the realm after Yaroslav's death in 1054. It might also be why Yaroslav appears to have ruled from Novgorod for the next few years rather than Kiev, likely administrating that city through one or more of his Druzina's boyars. Speaking of administration, you can't really talk about Yaroslav without bringing up law. Yaroslav is known for the first part of what would later be known as the Russkaya Pravda, the first written law code of the Rus. We don't know exactly when it was made, but it was likely early in his reign, so the 1020s is certainly possible. Nonetheless, Yaroslav's Pravda was quite short and mostly concerned with fines to be paid for resolving disputes amongst the Druzina and the urban elite, which speaks to the growing importance of both of these. It's also significant in allocating part of these fines as tithes to support the church. Overall, however, it appears to be mostly a codification of custom in order to have a legal standard for his stewards acting as lawgivers across the realm where Yaroslav himself couldn't be. Concerns with things like debt and contract fulfillment wouldn't come until later additions made by his descendants. Leaving the town now and turning to the countryside, it's hard to say much about life there with any certainty. Like most places in the Middle Ages, Kievan Rus was certainly an overwhelmingly rural society, despite the growing importance of its towns, but we don't know a whole lot about the specific relationship of the peasants to the towns or to the aristocracy at the time, despite many theories being proposed, especially occupying the minds of Soviet scholars. Rural people likely lived in hamlets, probably originating from old tribal and family divisions, and outside of the area in the south near Kiev, they probably used slash and burn techniques to cultivate the land in the forested north. Aristocrats like the boyars likely held estates in the countryside as well, probably raising livestock, though they seem to have lived primarily in the towns. And whether a feudal or manorial relationship existed between them and the peasantry at this time is, again, hard to know. We also have little knowledge on how far Christianity penetrated into the lives of the rural peasantry. The church was strongly supported by Vladimir, and especially Yaroslav, but the youth of the church amongst the Rus meant that its power was inherently tied to that of the princes, which was most heavily concentrated in the towns. There were several bishops, with dioceses based in the more important towns, and they were all headed by the Metropolitan of Kiev, who throughout the 1020s was probably John I. We know next to nothing about John, and in fact some sources say that he died all the way back in 1008, but we know that he was from Byzantium and that he was chosen by the Patriarch of Constantinople, though based on Yaroslav's enthusiasm for Christianity and his establishment of tithes and church building projects, the two probably had a fairly good relationship. Clerics were responsible for spiritual well-being, of course, but also for administering church law, which included marriage and matters related to family life. They had the job of promoting an Orthodox Christian lifestyle in a society which had been pagan just over 30 years ago. Quite the task. Trade and religion led Kievan Rus to have an interesting relationship with the Byzantine Empire across the Black Sea. This relationship was complex, sometimes hostile, sometimes friendly, but throughout the 1020s it seems to have been fairly smooth. Although Rus merchants were more likely to travel to Constantinople than Byzantines were to Kiev, the towns of the Rus were no strangers to Greeks, who might travel there as artisans of crafts new or unknown to the Rus, such as glassworking or church mosaics, or perhaps as clerics, especially this early on when the Rus didn't really have a strongly established clerical tradition of their own. In the north, Yaroslav's historic hold on Novgorod and its trade helped him establish a strong relationship with Scandinavia. He relied on Varangian mercenaries to bolster his military forces and placed a large emphasis on trade early in his reign. This relationship was cemented when in 1019 he married Ingigerd, known in Rus sources as Irene, the daughter of King Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden and sister of his successor Anund Jakob. This might explain why, after Olaf of Norway had his throne usurped by Knut the Great in 1028, the former king and his family took refuge at Yaroslav's court. Kievan Rus also had a complex relationship with the semi-nomadic Pechenegs who lived in the steppe along the northern coast of the Black Sea. The Pechenegs had often raided the frontier of the Kievan Rus, though they also sometimes allied with them. Boris was on his way to fight them when he was killed, and Svyatopolk had many of them in his army when he fought Yaroslav. They may have conducted some raids in the 1020s, but nothing that was big enough to have been recorded. To the west of the Rus was Poland, with which Yaroslav had a fairly sour relationship. This was due in part to Bolesław's support of Svyatopolk, as mentioned earlier, but also due to the fact that during that campaign, Bolesław took the Shevern towns, which had been a point of contention on the Rus-Polish frontier for some time. There was no open conflict with Poland in the 1020s, but Yaroslav and his brother Mstislav would take the Shevern towns back in 1031. Mstislav's contribution to that campaign was not as a loyal subject, however, but rather as an equal. You see, from his base in Tmutarakan around 1022, he subjugated a neighboring North Caucasus people known as the Kasogs, probably a group belonging to the modern Circassians. According to the primary chronicle, he fought their leader in single combat, and after winning, thanks in part to his Christian faith, he took his foe's wife and possessions and made the Kasogs his tributaries. In 1024, with his Druzhina, the Kasogs, and some Pecheneg allies, he marched to Kiev and seized it. The people of Kiev didn't accept him, however, and he instead settled down in the nearby town of Chernihiv. Yaroslav then came down from Novgorod with his own army, again bolstered with Varangian mercenaries, but Mstislav won the battle that followed. Instead of chasing his older brother out of the realm, however, the two made an arrangement to split it between them, with Yaroslav keeping Kiev, Novgorod, and the lands west of the Dnieper River, and Mstislav getting Chernihiv, Tmutarakan, and everything to the east. Why this arrangement was made is still up for debate. Maybe it was due to the strength of Kiev's Vichy rejecting Mstislav. Maybe it was because he, the son of a concubine and not Vladimir's primary wife like Yaroslav, had lost confidence in how much support he would have for his authority. In the end, we can only really make educated guesses. Under Mstislav, Chernihiv, which hadn't been all that important until then, grew to rival Kiev, and despite how later traditions might frame it, it seems like Mstislav was the more powerful of the two princes after this point. Yaroslav himself remained in Novgorod until 1026, when he had enough men to feel safe in Kiev, where the two brothers then reinforced their agreement and established a bond of fraternal cooperation. Throughout the 1020s, and for the rest of their joint reign, their relationship remained peaceful. But it wasn't until Mstislav's death without children in 1036 that Yaroslav could reinforce and build up the centrality of Kiev and once again be the true master of Kievan Rus. And that's going to be it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, I encourage you to click the like button and to subscribe to the channel to be notified of any future videos. You can also click, I think it's going to be here. There should be some links to other videos on my channel. Right now I only have 5, but there will be plenty more to come. If you have any suggestions for future videos in this series, or just any other future videos related to medieval history or history more generally that you'd like to have me make, I encourage you to write comments down below. Other than that, I thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.